When we had a Conservative government and Keir Starmer was the leader of the opposition, he was opposed to their policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Now Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister and he's talking about sending failed asylum seekers to countries like Albania. So, what's the difference? We will discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris in the studio.
And it's James also in the studio.
And it's Caitriona in the Washington studio.
We'll talk about all matters Trump in a second, and the bizarre case of who's going to Turkey to negotiate peace in Ukraine or not. But Chris, first of all, I wanted to talk about Keir Starmer going to Albania, and this slightly odd situation we had where he was in Albania but launching a sort of policy that Albania isn't going to, a deal that Albania's never going to do with him.
Yeah,
just explain what's going on.
There was this curious mismatch today between the most eye-catching idea that the Prime Minister was floating and the backdrop that he chose to float it. So there's this idea around illegal migration. It's been, for the government, a real week of talking about migration, trying to look muscular. This idea around illegal migration, that you have these so-called return hubs. So people who have exhausted legal avenues in the UK to stay, they are failed asylum seekers, but where the government might fear that they will find mechanisms to try and delay, put off their deportation, perhaps changing their circumstances, starting a family, losing their paperwork, that kind of stuff, could be sent to a return hub en route, in theory, to being returned to their home country. So the government is talking to a handful of European countries, we think broadly in the Balkans, about that idea. They're not naming which countries yet. There aren't any deals there yet to be signed. There he is in Albania, which has a migrants deal with Italy across the Adriatic. Prime Minister's there because the European political community, that organisation that is the EU plus others, is meeting on Friday. He's talking up this idea of the return hubs. And so perfectly reasonably, the question is, well, what about doing one with Albania? He is stood next to the Albanian Prime Minister at the time, and the Albanian Prime Minister says, no, not with you guys, or indeed with anyone else. We've done one with Italy and or an arrangement with Italy around migrants. And that is that. So now Downing Street are trying to say, look, we never thought there would be one with Albania. But it is a little bit, awkward in terms of what it looks like. It's a reminder of just the challenge of trying to find workable solutions or parts of a solution to dealing with the small boats issue. 12,000 people now this calendar year have crossed the channel by small boat.
And let's hear a little bit of what Keir Starmer said when he was in Albania.
We are in talks with a number of countries about return hubs, and I see them as a really important innovation, and that is consistent with the work that we've done in relation to UK-Albania reduction in numbers, the work that we've done on law enforcement arrangements with other countries, the return agreements that we've put in place, the record number of returns, and what I'd like to do is add return hubs to that. We are in those talks, and therefore at the appropriate time, I'll be able to give you further details in relation to it.
And James, we should just clarify that at first listen, a return hub might sound a little bit like the Rwanda program that the previous government had, but this is different.
Yeah, the Rwanda scheme was where people would be sent to Rwanda where their claim would be assessed. This is a scheme where these are people who their assessment has already been completed, and then and they haven't succeeded, and they have been sent out. So it is a different scheme, but it still involves, a degree of the process taking place outside of the UK as an attempt to deter.
And Chris, this has been quite a big week in the government's conversation about immigration. This is the first time you and I have actually chatted about the Prime Minister's speech on Monday. And that phrase it's really lodged in my brain, which is a sign of a successful political phrase, whether people agree with it or disagree with it, love it or hate it. The idea that Britain could become an island of strangers. How do you think that phrase has kind of lodged in the Westminster mind now? And obviously there's not one mind at Westminster, but you know.
I think the key observation is that it has lodged. It has lodged in the mind, in so much as these things ever can. I think it has. And Downing Street knew what they were doing. That not everyone in the Labour Party is happy with it. I think they feel that they have got to be seen to be muscular, and that in delivering ideas that they hope it points to a trend over time of reducing the net migration figures. That's going to take some time, and in the meantime, they want language that shows their intent. What we will get next week, next Thursday, is the next set. They come every 6 months. The next set of net migration figures, they will be considerably down. We know that from the visas that have been granted. What we don't know is the emigration element, which obviously is the other side of the equation as far as net migration is concerned, taking the emigration off the immigration. The number will be well down, but it'll still be in 300,000-400,000 probably. And the aim from the measures that the government announced the other day, and which will come in there, some will be short term, some will require legislation in the next couple of years, is to squeeze it by about another 100,000 a year by the end of the Parliament. But they need to be able to, they are of the view, they need to be able to demonstrate that is that downward trend. And they're willing to repeat the language. The Prime Minister repeated the phrase at Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday.
Did they deliberately echo Enoch Powell, or was that just happenstance?
When he said "rivers of blood" in 1968.
Well, there's a phrase in that same speech. There was an expression, I can't remember precisely, where they talked. Enoch Powell used that phrase, "strangers." So was it a deliberate echo, or do people even know who Enoch Powell was these days? In terms of
It's a fair question.
We could do an old newscast episode about that speech.
Yeah. So I've asked that question, and I've not got a straight answer. Is the honest truth. I would be surprised if those compiling a speech like that weren't aware of the history of that kind of phrase. Would be my kind of hunch. And they make the argument that if you look at the paragraph, if you like, that the Prime Minister said, the overall context is arguably pretty different from what we heard sort of generation or two ago. But I think, the desire to grab people's attention with that phrase from someone who a matter of a couple of years ago was talking up the merits of freedom of movement, was talking about a second referendum as far as Brexit is concerned, etc., etc. That's one heck of a move.
And also then the whole conversation about whether does the scale of that rhetoric, is that matched by the actual scale of the reforms to the immigration system that the government is proposing, on which there's lots of different views. Caitriona, to go back to where we started and talking about this idea of people being sent to somewhere like Albania after they've exhausted all their legal avenues, maybe multiple attempts through the UK's asylum system. I just wonder from America and what Donald Trump's administration is doing with sending people to various places, whether that sounds like a very kind of like low-calorie approach as opposed to what the American administration is currently doing.
Well, definitely the language is a lot more polite, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about return hubs. Here they're called deportation centres, and everything about it's quite harsh from the outset. There's no attempt to make it sound polite or nice. And as we've seen in the last few months, people are just being rounded up off the streets sometimes. When they come in for regular appointments with immigration officials, they're being detained without due process largely, which is why we're seeing all of these lawsuits about so much of this. And, President Trump's plans have been broadly actually very efficient and effective. If you look at the numbers of people who are crossing the borders here, it's way down since he came into office. But many of those policies are mired up in various court proceedings, and it will be many months before they're unwound and we see just where they land.
Yeah, and I know there's multiple court processes going on, but does it look like his agenda is going to be stymied by the courts, or is he going to be able to get some wins here?
Well, there are so many different initiatives that he's taking on. I mean, the big one today that we're focusing on is the Supreme Court has been hearing arguments about President Trump's efforts to restrict or ban entirely this birthright citizenship, which basically under the Constitution, it's been broadly interpreted since 1898 that if you're born in America, you have an automatic right to citizenship. Now, there are some exceptions. If you're born to diplomats, for example, you're thought to have an allegiance to another jurisdiction, so your children don't get citizenship. If you're here illegally, undocumented, if you don't have paperwork, if you have criminal endeavours and so on. But it's always been thought that that is the law until President Trump signed an executive order. One of the first he signed actually upon coming into office this second time. 3 judges at federal courts have banned it, and they've issued nationwide injunctions, which means they've banned it not just in their state, but for the whole country. until it weeds its way right up through the Supreme Court. So the Trump administration has challenged these bans, as you would imagine it would, but it sought to challenge them not on what they're actually trying to do in terms of remove that citizenship entitlement, but they've challenged it on the legality of nationwide jurisdiction. So they've been hearing those arguments this morning, but in hearing those arguments, the Supreme Court has also been hearing what's at the crux of it. So they're very divided based on the questions they've been asking. And interestingly, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who's one of President Trump's appointees the first time round, he's been asking the question, well, what are hospitals supposed to do with babies when they're born then? If they're not citizens, or if there isn't a nationwide ban, you're born in New York and you're a citizen, you're born across the bridge in New Jersey because maybe you're in a taxi or an ambulance and you didn't get to the hospital on time, your mom didn't get to the hospital on time, suddenly you're not a citizen. So we'll have to wait for that ruling to come down, but that has the potential to impact a lot of what President Trump is doing, not just on immigration and citizenship, but on many other things where there have been these nationwide bans or temporary injunctions issued.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people say, oh, this returns hub that the UK wants to set up somewhere in the Western Balkans, they're copying what Italy is doing with Albania. It's like, well, actually, the Italian courts have stepped in and stopped Italy doing it. So you had the Rwanda policy being challenged in the courts in the UK. You've got the Italian policy being challenged in the Italian courts. You've got Donald Trump being challenged in the American courts. It's a reminder that reforming immigration systems, because it's to do with people's lives and their rights, it's quite easy to announce something and a different thing to actually implement it.
Completely that. And that's, I think, exactly what we're seeing so many Western governments wrestle with, aren't we? And I think that's going to go on for... That's been one of the stories of the next generation, I think, really.
Decades. So if you look at the demographics, particularly in Africa, the scale of the birth rate is so high that there are. If you talk to African leaders, they're all worried about migration within Africa as people go from poorer parts to wealthier parts, and then ultimately the impact that will have of other people trying to move out of Africa to other parts of Europe where you've got population decline and aging populations. This is not something that's just going to be here for it's not just about fixing the boats. It's a much longer problem.
Chris, you mentioned this meeting that the other reason Keir Starmer is in Albania is for this European political community. European political communities is going to be a big theme the next few days because there's then another big UK-EU meeting on Monday where we're going to get the reset in action.
Yeah. We are.
Reset of the relationship between London and Brussels.
Yeah, so the EU sort of top brass will be in London, and there'll be the flags and the handshakes and all the rest of it. And this will be the sense of what this much talked about, quote unquote, reset, that is the language that the Prime Minister's been using since the election, best part of a year ago, all stacks up to. And there's going to be a meeting, I hear, of the EU ambassadors on Sunday to sign off where they've got up to. Someone was saying to me today there's a little bit of a parallel with the arrangement we saw with Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago. In other words, there'll be a sort of heads of chapters kind of sense to it, and then plenty more discussions to come in the mix. And this is where it's all a bit deja vu from the Brexit years. Fish, movement, in this context, youth mobility. Be curious to see how that is badged, because there's a real nervousness on this side of the channel about that looking or smelling like free movement, even if it is time limited and age limited, which by the definition of youth mobility it's going to be or likely to be. What else is there? Your old favourite of sanitary and phytosanitary,
SPS.
The whole business of animal products being moved around. Dynamic alignment, the idea of, does the UK sign up to EU rules that over time might change and the UK will have to accept those changes? Hugely contested area as far as the post-Brexit settlement is concerned. Into James's territory of defence and security, that's in the mix too. So yeah, it'll be quite a thing, really, I think.
And will there be direct oversight by the European Court of Justice, or will there be an independent arbitration panel where the EU side can ask the European Court of Justice for an opinion that can be then copied and pasted and sent to the independent arbitration panel? I can't wait. How will I sleep on Sunday night?
I hope
knowing that that's about to be revealed.
If only we had somebody who was deep in the weeds, who had a nerd-like fascination for EU rules. I don't know. Is there one to hand?
And also doesn't have to be on the news all day on the day it happens, so we can actually
read it. Yeah, no, exactly, completely.
Isn't the interesting question is whether or not any of this stacks up to meet the challenge of the era?
Yes.
Because there is a risk that we end up looking at minutiae. I mean, in the big grand scheme of things, youth mobility, phytosanitary, all of that, it's low grade stuff. The real substantial engagement between the UK and European nations at the moment is over Ukraine and is over the defence of this continent against Russia in the years going forward. And fundamentally, that's my patch. So sort of that I would say that's more important. But I think that is for me the interesting question.
Caitriona, we're recording this episode of Newscast on Thursday evening, and everyone's sort of playing a sort of game of guess who, where in Turkey, because a few days ago we'd have thought like all the main players, maybe not Donald Trump, but all the main players in the Russia-Ukraine conflict were going to go to Turkey to have face-to-face talks, not necessarily talks that would come up with like a final deal on the conflict, but something that would seem quite momentous. And on Thursday night, we're like, hang on, who's there? It's not even the B list or the C list.
That's it. And we're slightly still guessing as well, because President Trump has teased just in the last hour or two that when he's leaving the Middle East, that he's almost destination unknown. Probably Washington, D.C., he said, but you never know. I'll go where I need to be, or words to that effect. So still very much teasing. But yeah, as you say, as of now, the talks in Istanbul on Friday are, the Ukrainian defense minister will be there, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who of course is also the National Security Advisor, the director of USAID and the head of the National Archives. He will be there. And then it's a Russian presidential advisor and again, some, lower level individuals there. So not what we had thought, not what President Putin himself, we have to remember, was the one who put forward the notion of having these high level talks in the first place. And as we know, as of last night, his name not on that attendance list. Is there still a will he, won't he element? Might he turn up? Who knows?
So I'm just going to revise what I said. It sounds like from the Russian side, it's C list. From the Ukrainian side, it's B list. And the American side, it's B list, but with the prospect of the A list.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
James, what's your take on just this moment we're at now? Because a few days ago, it sounded like this could be one of those pivots in the conflict, and now it's just it's more of a rather than a pivot. Not to make light of an important subject, obviously.
I personally, I was always sceptical because the bottom line is I have yet to see any evidence that Russia, Vladimir Putin, has changed his position and is willing actually to negotiate in any shape or form whatsoever. And therefore, even if there is some kind of engagement that face-to-face between some Ukrainians and some Russians or whatever level, clearly that is a thing because it hasn't happened since 2022. But the bottom line is that we're in exactly the same position. You've got the Ukrainians, you've got Zelensky desperately trying to stay in with the Russians by saying, look, I'm willing to do anything. I'll do a 30-day ceasefire. You ask that, I'll do it. You want me to go to Turkey? I'll go to Turkey. I'll talk to whoever you want me to talk to, and just to stay on board. You've got the Europeans trying to keep the pressure on Putin by saying to the Americans, look, it's Putin who is slowing this down. He's the refusenik here. And yet you've got the Americans still refusing to give any kind of pressure on Putin, put a time scale, anything that actually sort of says, yeah, you've really got to come to the table. Because if you think about it, Donald Trump's now in his third position since Saturday. On Saturday, when he sat down and had that conversation with all the three, would you remember that picture of Starmer and Macron met around the mobile phone with President Zelensky, and they agreed, okay, we've got a plan. We demand a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, and if not, we'll put massive new sanctions on. The next day, Putin says, no, let's have some talks in Turkey on Thursday. So Trump says, oh, okay, let's do that. Right, completely undermining the united European-American strategy. And then today has sort of become a bit of a farce. And so on his plane, Trump said, look, this is only going to get sorted if I meet Putin, if we see each other, which is now the third position and one that undermines the Ukrainians because essentially we're back in the same place, which is that this is a Trump-Putin conversation that can solve the problem.
Which is basically back to square one.
Without Zelensky.
Which is basically back to square one.
We're still where we are. And, is the Europeans and the Ukrainians are hoping that eventually the penny will drop in Washington, that the Russians are never going to come round to this, and that actually the only way Putin will come to the table if some pressure is leveraged. The problem is that Donald Trump is widely seen not only to want to end the war in Ukraine, but also to have a rapprochement between Washington and Moscow, to have a reset of the US-Russian relationship. Those two are different priorities, and nobody really knows which is the primary issue for him, because it's entirely possible that Donald Trump could lose interest in Ukraine while still maintaining his desire to have a new relationship. He talks a lot about business negotiation, business deals. Steve Witkoff, his envoy, echoes that language too.
Caitriona, can you help us out on that?
Yeah, I would just say two things that happen in the Middle East or are happening might slightly inspire President Putin to maybe make a move. But, I agree with James. He hasn't made any evidence in that regard yet. But President Trump lifting the sanctions on Syria, and it looks like they're about to do a deal with Iran as well, and will lift the sanctions, or at least most of the economic sanctions on Iran. So President Trump is doing things that other American presidents don't do, and, would traditionally be a deeply unpopular thing to do, lifting sanctions without actually seeing anything up front as the reason for lifting those sanctions. So, if there's anything that maybe might move Putin along, maybe it's the concept of these sanctions might be lifted, what it seems to be ultimately looking for. The big grey area, though, is, of course, President Trump threatened extra sanctions if President Putin didn't move towards peace. So is he actually going to do that, given that he does want this warmer relationship that James has been describing there? So, we're kind of in the realm of total and utter guesswork here with individuals that are, playing, I don't know if it's chess or it's some kind of, one-upmanship thing that's going on, but there's definitely some kind of mind games happening.
Or like chess, but with the rules of Monopoly. I was really struck on the last episode of Newscast that I did, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds. And I was chatting to the other Chris Steele, the former MI6 officer who's Russia analyst. And he was saying, and Steve Rosenberg, our Moscow colleague, was saying that the amount of anti-British rhetoric and propaganda coming out of the Kremlin now is massive.
I think sometimes the UK is a proxy. And if you have a Russian media that isn't entirely sure what Vladimir Putin's attitude to Donald Trump is, and you need to have a good kicking of the West, if you can't be explicit with the Americans, because they don't want to be too hard on the Americans if suddenly Putin turns around and there is a reset. Yeah. So if, as well as just going for Zelensky, then you need to go for somebody else in the West who is supporting Zelensky, and therefore they might as well go for us because we're the British, and there's a history to all of that. Some Russians there's a sort of romantic hark back to their past connections with France. We've all read our Tolstoy, and so occasionally they'd like to pick on us. But also, there's for me, it's like the Iranians, who America's the big Satan, we're the little Satan. We're always seen as the sort of little mini me, and the gag, of course, is always that the Iranians see is the last remaining country that thinks that the UK is still a great power on the world, because we're always to blame for everything. And literally, it's beyond the competence of most British governments. But I think that's probably a factor as well in the Russian media barrage, simply because the British government, led by Boris Johnson, got in early. And so in support of Ukraine, and so we sort of always we're lodged into the Russian psyche in that regard.
All makes sense. James, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And Chris and Caitriona, your annotated copies of War and Peace are in the post. Thank you.
Thank you. That was spectacular, Adam. The best newscast ever.
At last, somebody gussed about me. Right, that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.